You had a chose every single time. That's what makes it a tragedy and not an accident.
The first thing you noticed about Officer Marcus Webb's hands was the wedding ring, a thick gold band that caught the late afternoon sun as his fingers froze completely in midair, holding open a small black leather credential case like it had just burned him. His lips were moving, not speaking, moving, reading. The same 4 words over and over again, the way a man rereads a diagnosis he cannot accept. His jaw had gone slack, and the arrogance that had carried him through 11 years of policing, 11 years of swagger and sirens, and the particular pleasure of watching people flinch when he walked toward them, was draining out of his face in real time, pooling somewhere around his boots on the hot asphalt of Linden Heights. Behind him, 7 feet back, his rookie partner Dale Pruitt had stepped forward just far enough to read over Webb's shoulder. And then Pruitt took 2 full steps backward, as if proximity to what was printed on that ID card might somehow be physically contagious. Across the quiet suburban street, a woman stood at her mailbox pillar with her phone raised, thumb steady on the record button, capturing every second of it. And leaning against the hood of a rented 2019 Chevy Malibu, hands still flat and visible on the warm metal, was a 56-year-old black man with graying temples and a posture forged by 28 years of federal service, still facing the car, still calm, still waiting as if he had known exactly how this moment was going to feel before it even arrived. Officer Marcus Webb looked up from the credential case, then back down at it, then up again. This is what happens when a man who has spent his entire career mistaking cruelty for authority pulls over the wrong person on a quiet Tuesday afternoon and hands that person brick by brick every single thing they need to dismantle him. Go back 23 minutes. The neighborhood of Linden Heights was the kind of place that made a certain type of police officer feel territorial without quite being able to explain why wide tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, driveways with late-model SUVs, the kind of quiet prosperity that people like Marcus Webb had decided, somewhere deep in the unexamined part of themselves, belonged to a specific kind of person. Webb had been parked in the shade of an overgrown oak tree on Callaway Drive for the better part of 40 minutes, his cruiser idling, the air conditioning blasting, when the silver Malibu drifted past his hiding spot at exactly 25 miles per hour with its out-of-state rental plates and its too careful driver. He leaned forward. Marcus Webb was 43 years old, 11-year veteran of the Oak Ridge Police Department, buzz-cut a decade out-of-style neck thick as a ham with a personnel file that his union rep described as colorful, and his captain described privately as a liability waiting to fully materialize. His reputation in the department was that of a proactive officer, which was the word colleagues used when they wanted to sound neutral. The community had different words for it. He had a philosophy, and he was not shy about sharing it with Dale Pruitt, his rookie partner, who was 7 months out of the academy and still naive enough to believe that experience would eventually make him more comfortable rather than less. Webb shifted the cruiser into drive, his eyes fixed on the Malibu's taillights, and explained it the way a man explains something he has explained 100 times before, casually, almost lovingly. That zip codes were probable cause, that rental plates were a signal that a man driving that carefully through this particular neighborhood wasn't being a good driver. He was performing innocence, and a real cop knew the difference. Pruitt said nothing. He had learned in 7 months that saying nothing was the only language Webb respected. The man in the Malibu was Calvin Mercer, 56 years old, graying at the temples, wearing a charcoal jacket over a pressed navy shirt, hands at exactly 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He was taking the scenic route back to his hotel from the airport, familiarizing himself with the city streets before what he had circled on his calendar simply as Monday. He wasn't thinking about the cruiser idling in the shade behind him. He was thinking about a consent decree and a stack of case files and whether the hotel restaurant would still be serving after 9. The cut grass smell drifted through his cracked window. The afternoon sun hammered the asphalt gold. His turn signal ticked once lazily as he rounded the corner onto West Callaway. 2 blocks behind him, Webb hit his lights. Denise Holbrook had lived on the corner of West Calloway and Birch for 12 years, long enough to have developed a specific bone-deep familiarity with the feeling that settled in her stomach whenever she saw the red and blue lights ignite behind a car that had done absolutely nothing wrong. She was watering the flower bed along her front walkway when it happened, the sudden strobing light, the brief whoop of the siren to confirm the stop, the careful, unhurried way the Malibu eased to the shoulder like its driver had done this before and knew better than to give anyone any reason for anything. She turned off the hose. She didn't think about it the way people think about decisions. It was more automatic than that, more rooted in 12 years of watching this street and knowing what tended to happen when nobody was paying attention. Her phone was already in the pocket of her denim jacket. She pulled it out, opened the camera, and hit record before she was even fully leaned against the brick pillar of her mailbox, using it for cover the way she'd seen people do in videos she'd watched and quietly hoped she'd never need to make herself. She didn't know the man in the Malibu. She didn't know his name or where he was from or where he was going. She just knew what this looked like. And she had decided somewhere in the 12 years of watching this neighborhood from this front lawn that she was not going to be the person who turned the hose back on and went inside. She held the phone steady. She kept the frame wide. She pressed her back against the warm brick, and she waited. Webb's approach to the Malibu was the kind of walk that communicated ownership, wide stance, heavy footfall, hand resting on the butt of his holster, not because he anticipated a threat, but because the weight of it felt like authority made physical. And Marcus Webb had always confused those two things. He did not introduce himself. He did not state his name, his badge number, or the reason for the stop. He simply appeared at the driver's side window and leaned down so that his face was inches from Calvin Mercer's, close enough that Calvin could smell the stale coffee on his breath, and said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence and the proximity do what he believed they were supposed to do. Calvin's windows were already down, all four of them, not just the driver's side, and his keys were sitting on top of the dashboard where Webb could see them, and both of his hands were resting flat and still on the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2. He had been doing this since before Webb was old enough to hold a badge. The first exchange between them lasted about 90 seconds, and in those 90 seconds something became very clear to Dale Pruitt, hovering nervously near the cruiser's front bumper. 15 feet back, the man in the Malibu was not afraid. He was not performing calm the way frightened people perform calm. He was actually genuinely constitutionally unbothered, and this was doing something to Webb that Pruitt had never seen anything do to Webb before. Calvin narrated every single movement before he made it. My wallet is in my left breast pocket. I am going to reach for it with my left hand with the quiet, methodical precision of someone who had been taught or had learned the hard way, or both. That narration was armor. He retrieved his license and his rental agreement and extended them through the window, and Webb snatched them with the particular aggression of a man who has decided that the act of handing something over politely is itself an insult. Webb read the name on the license the way he read everything, skimming, dismissing, deciding before looking. He saw what he wanted to see. A name, a Washington, D.C. address, an out-of-towner in a neighborhood where he didn't belong, wearing a suit that cost more than Webb's monthly take-home. He used the first name deliberately, Calvin, the way men like Webb use first names, as a small calculated diminishment, a reminder of who has the badge and who has the rental car. Calvin's response was 5 words delivered in a baritone so measured it sounded almost gentle, which made it land harder than if he had shouted, "I'd prefer Mr. Mercer, please." 50 feet away, Denise Holbrook zoomed in slightly. A distant lawnmower hummed 2 blocks east, and then, as if the street itself were paying attention, went quiet. What happened over the next 7 minutes was a masterclass in a very specific kind of American ugliness, the kind that happens when a man who has never been genuinely challenged confuses his discomfort with a legal justification, and then starts building backward from the conclusion he's already reached. Webb cited Pennsylvania versus Mims as his authority for ordering Calvin out of the vehicle, except that he cited it incorrectly, got the threshold wrong, misidentified the standard. and Calvin let him finish the sentence before quietly, without any performance of superiority, reciting the actual holding of the case, the actual standard, the actual limitation it placed on officers, and the specific constitutional requirement Webb had just failed to meet. The silence that followed was the loudest thing on West Callaway Street. Dale Pruitt, standing at the bumper, looked at his boots. Webb's face went through several expressions in the space of about 4 seconds. Confusion, then irritation, then something that looked almost like panic before it hardened back into aggression, because aggression was the only tool Marcus Webb had ever really learned to use, and men who only have one tool tend to reach for it hardest when it's failing them. He ordered Calvin out of the vehicle. Calvin asked calmly and without hostility for the articulable suspicion that legally supported the order, because he knew, and now Webb was beginning to understand, he knew exactly what that phrase meant and exactly what it required. Webb told him his suspicion was that Calvin was being an arrogant loudmouth, interfering with a police investigation, and threatened to drag him through the window. Calvin unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out slowly, narrating every movement, complying fully and deliberately, and with the kind of controlled composure that makes men like Webb absolutely furious, because fury requires a target that flinches, and Calvin Mercer had not flinched once. He was 2 inches taller than Webb, and the height difference registered on Webb's face the way unexpected cold registers a quick involuntary tightening around the eyes. He stepped back and unclasped the retention strap on his holster, which Denise across the street captured in close-up detail, her phone held absolutely steady. The pat-down was rough and theatrical and designed to humiliate rather than to find anything Webb's hands slapping and pressing with the practiced aggression of a man who knew on some level that humiliation was the actual point. He was narrating too, now keeping up a running commentary about what he expected to find. What kind of person drove rental cars through this neighborhood, what the courts were going to think about a man who couldn't comply with a simple, lawful order. And then his hands hit something in Calvin's inner jacket pocket. Something rectangular, solid, leather-cased. Webb's voice shifted into a kind of theatrical excitement, the tone of a man who has convinced himself he's about to be proven right, who has needed to be proven right so badly for the last 6 minutes that he has stopped being able to think clearly. He yanked the case out of Calvin's pocket and held it up. Calvin, still facing the car roof, his palms flat on the hot metal, said something in a voice so quiet and steady that Pruitt would replay it in his memory for weeks afterward that he strongly recommended Webb open it. Read every word carefully and take his time. Webb flipped it open. And that is exactly where we came in. The badge was the first thing, heavy, intricate federal-grade silver with a level of detail that local and state shields simply did not have, the kind of badge that exists in a different category from the one Webb wore on his chest, the kind that carries weight in rooms where Webb would never be allowed without an appointment. Webb looked at it for maybe 2 seconds before his eyes moved to the photo ID card secured in the opposite panel of the leather case, and he began to read, United States Department of Justice. He got that far and stopped. His eyes went back to the beginning. United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Special Litigation Section. He read the name. He read it again. He looked up at the back of Calvin Mercer's head, still calm, still facing the car, still waiting, and then back down at the ID because his brain was doing something that brains do when they encounter information that fundamentally contradicts everything they have decided to believe. It was refusing to process it, insisting there must be an error, looking for the seam where the forgery was hiding. Calvin Mercer, Deputy Assistant Attorney General. The credential case, which had felt like nothing in his hand 30 seconds ago, now seemed to weigh something real and significant, like holding a document whose full implications were still arriving word by word, and each one landing a little harder than the last. His hands had begun to tremble, not dramatically, not the kind of trembling that anyone would have noticed from a distance, but the fine, involuntary vibration of a nervous system that has just received information it doesn't know what to do with. The embedded holographic strip on the ID card caught the late afternoon sun and threw a small, precise rainbow across Webb's knuckles. He read it a third time. Behind him, Dale Pruitt had drifted forward by 3 steps without consciously deciding to move, pulled by the same gravitational force that pulls everyone toward a car accident. And he looked over Webb's shoulder at the credential case and read what was printed there, and understood immediately and completely what it meant, and took 2 full, deliberate steps backward as if the credential card were something that could spread. Tommy Pruitt said very quietly, and his voice had a texture in it that Webb had never heard from him before. Webb did not respond. His ego was making its last stand, a desperate, disorganized, loud last stand, declaring the credential a forgery because that was the only available exit from the corner he had built around himself. He said it with the volume of a man trying to convince himself, called it a federal offense to impersonate a DOJ official, promised Calvin a one-way trip to county, and reached for his radio with hands that were visibly shaking. Calvin Mercer did not turn around. He said quietly into the middle distance that Webb should call his watch commander right now, give him the name Calvin Mercer, and see what happened. The cicadas had stopped. The distant sound of a sprinkler 2 lawns down had cut off. The street had gone so completely silent that the crackle of Webb's radio as dispatch acknowledged the call felt enormous and intrusive, like a sound dropped into a church. The wait was 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Webb stood holding the credential case with both hands. Now he had stopped being able to hold it with one, staring at Calvin with an expression that was trying to be contempt and landing much closer to terror. Calvin leaned against the side of the Malibu and adjusted his shirt cuffs and waited with the particular patience of a man who has already seen how this ends. Across the street, Denise Holbrook had lowered her phone by about 2 inches, her mouth slightly open, her eyes moving between the trembling officer and the utterly still man by the car. Then she raised the phone back up, made sure the frame was steady, and kept recording because whatever was about to happen, she understood instinctively that it needed to exist permanently. The black Ford Explorer came around the corner at speed, tires squealing. Captain Gerald Foss hit the brakes so hard the Explorer's front end dipped, and he was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped rocking, moving across the sidewalk with the urgent, exhausted stride of a man who had been dreading this specific phone call, or one like it, for the better part of 18 months. He was 51 years old, Captain Foss, with the permanent creases of someone who had spent the last year and a half in an unwinnable position trying to hold together a department that kept finding new ways to come apart, negotiating consent decree language with federal attorneys at 10 o'clock at night, sitting in Zoom calls where every question felt like a trap, and every answer felt like a confession. He was not a corrupt man. He was something in some ways more tragic, a decent man who had tolerated too much for too long because he had convinced himself that tolerance was the same as management. He snatched the credential case from Webb's hand before Webb could even begin whatever sentence he had been preparing. He looked down at the ID. He looked up at the man leaning against the Malibu. The blood left Captain Gerald Foss's face so completely and so quickly that Pruitt, watching from 15 feet away, genuinely wondered for a moment if he was about to watch his captain pass out on the sidewalk. Foss knew Calvin Mercer. Not personally, not in the way you know someone you've had dinner with, but in the way you know the name of the person who holds a document that could end your career and your department simultaneously. For 6 months, Calvin Mercer's office had been the other end of the phone calls that kept Foss awake until 2 in the morning. The consent decree, the compliance timelines, the required reforms that the union kept finding procedural ways to delay. Calvin Mercer was the man who could, with a single recommendation to the federal court, place the entire Oak Ridge Police Department into federal receivership by the end of the business week. He was not a bureaucrat. He was a reckoning that had been assigned a specific arrival date, and that date had been Monday. Webb had pulled him over on a Tuesday afternoon for driving while black through a neighborhood that his rental car's GPS had simply identified as a route to his hotel. Foss rounded on Webb, and his voice dropped to the particular register that is somehow more frightening than shouting that barely controlled whisper of a man choosing his words with great care, because he is aware that whatever he says next is going to be documented, and asked him slowly if he had any idea at all, what he had just done. Webb tried. He made one last attempt to hold the line, insisted the credentials were forged, that the stop was justified, that Calvin had been combative, and Captain Foss silenced him with a single sharp sentence and turned away from him like a man closing a door. He has decided he will never open again. He turned to Calvin and smoothed the front of his uniform shirt in a gesture so instinctive and so revealing that Denise, watching from across the street, felt the knot in her stomach shift into something else. Something that felt almost like disbelief at how quickly the dynamic of a street changed when the right name was read off a piece of paper. Calvin spoke for about 90 seconds. He did not raise his voice. He stated what had happened in the precise sequential language of a man who has written legal briefs about encounters exactly like this one: the stop without cause, the racial coding in the language, the unlawful search, the rookie officer positioned to witness and absorb all of it, as if it were normal, as if it were training. Then he told Captain Foss what he needed: the badge, the weapon, unpaid administrative leave effective immediately on this sidewalk before anyone got back in a vehicle and drove anywhere. Foss didn't hesitate. He turned to Webb and ordered it. Marcus Webb's hand shook as he unholstered his sidearm and held it out, and the metallic sound of his badge dropping into Captain Foss's waiting palm was quiet and small and final in a way that a gunshot never is, because a gunshot is sudden, and this was inevitable. Across the street, Denise watched the officer hand over his badge and weapon, and she lowered her phone slowly and whispered something to herself, and then she went inside. Denise was inside her house with the deadbolt thrown before the Explorer had even pulled away from the curb, and her hands were shaking as she connected to her Wi-Fi and began uploading the 9 minutes and 42 seconds of raw, unedited video she had just recorded on a Tuesday afternoon on West Callaway Street. She captioned it simply, without drama, without hashtags, without any of the viral chasing language she had seen on 100 other videos. Oak Ridge officer harasses black man, turns out to be DOJ official. She posted it to 3 platforms simultaneously at 4:17 in the afternoon. By 8 o'clock that evening, it had 60,000 views. By the time the sun came up Saturday morning, it had crossed 14 million, and the number was still climbing with the vertical urgency of something that had touched a nerve so deep and so wide that the internet had simply decided collectively that this was the thing it needed to watch and share and talk about this weekend. National news networks ran the clip on a loop. Legal analysts spent hours dissecting the constitutional knowledge Calvin had deployed at a car window on a Tuesday. The precise moment Webb's face froze over the open credential case, that particular expression of arrogance converting in real time to horror became a meme, a symbol, a mirror that a significant portion of the country found they could not look away from. Marcus Webb watched himself on a 58-inch television from an old recliner in a living room that already felt emptier than it had 48 hours ago because his wife had packed a bag for herself and their 2 kids and driven them to her mother's place in a suburb of Columbus, and she had not said much when she left, which was worse than if she had said everything. His phone rang at 10:15. The caller ID said Greg Sutton, Union President. Greg Sutton was the kind of man who had built an entire career out of the architecture of protection, finding the procedural crack, drafting the ambiguous statement, applying the right pressure to the right person at the right moment to ensure that the badge survived what the man behind it had done. He had done it for Webb twice before at a much smaller scale, and he delivered his strategy now with the practiced confidence of someone who had not yet fully grasped the difference between the situations he had navigated before and the one currently spread across 14 million screens. He told Webb they would frame it as a high-stress misunderstanding, that Calvin had been combative, that the stop was procedurally defensible, and then, almost as an aside, he mentioned the woman who had filmed it. Denise Holbrook, West Callaway Street, easy enough to find, and said she needed to understand that she had made a dangerous enemy and that someone would make sure she understood that tonight. Webb stared at the phone after the call ended and felt for the first time in a long time something he had not expected to feel: the specific nauseating discomfort of a man who has just recognized himself clearly and does not like what he sees. At 2 in the morning, a dark OPD SUV with its headlights off parked at the end of Denise's driveway and sat there idling for the better part of an hour and a half. Denise woke up to the sound of the engine. She looked through her blinds and understood immediately what she was looking at. She did not panic. She pulled out her phone, opened her Ring camera app, confirmed that the unit number on the vehicle was clearly visible in the footage downloaded. It opened her email and addressed it to the DOJ public contact she had found in 30 seconds of searching for the Oak Ridge Consent Decree Monitoring Office. The subject line was 2 words: witness intimidation. She pressed send and went back to bed. 50 miles away, in a mid-range downtown Marriott with beige walls and a desk lamp that buzzed faintly when you turned it all the way up, Calvin Mercer was sitting at the small desk near the window reviewing the preliminary compliance assessment for Monday's meeting when his laptop made the soft chime of a new email arriving. He opened it. He watched the 47-second Ring camera video of the dark, unmarked OPD SUV idling at the end of a residential driveway with its lights off at 2 in the morning. He watched it once. His expression did not change, not in the way that people's expressions change when they're surprised, because Calvin was not surprised, the way a cardiologist is not surprised when the test comes back with what they expected to find, which is different from not caring, and he set the laptop aside and picked up his phone. He dialed a number he had called before, and it rang twice before a sharp, awake voice answered, which told him that Dana Reeves was also still working at this hour, which was one of the reasons he liked working with her. He told Special Agent Reeves that they were no longer waiting until Monday. He needed the GPS telematics and dispatch logs for every OPD cruiser in the fleet subpoenaed and in federal hands by dawn, because there was a confirmed witness intimidation case in progress right now tonight. And the vehicle doing it was going to show up in those records with a timestamp and a location that would remove any conceivable ambiguity about what had been ordered and who had ordered it. Reeves said understood, and the call was over in less than 2 minutes. Calvin set his phone face down on the desk and looked at the window for a long moment, not at anything specific, just at the city lights diffused through the glass, the orange smear of street lamps, and the occasional white pulse of headlights on the highway overpass 2 blocks east. He had done this in 9 cities now. Different names, different precincts, different officers who had decided at some point in their careers that the badge was a ceiling instead of a floor, that it protected them from consequence rather than binding them to a higher standard of it. The work was the same every time. The paperwork was different. The faces were different. The moment when a captain's face drained of color because he finally understood which name he was reading, that moment was always the same, always felt the same, like watching something inevitable finally arrive. Calvin went back to his case files and read until 4 in the morning, when he finally turned off the desk lamp and lay down on top of the covers without changing his clothes. Monday was going to be a long day. The trap was set. The Linden Heights precinct had spent Saturday night walking directly into it step by step with the lights off. Monday morning arrived over Oak Ridge with the particular quality of light that belongs to days that are going to matter hard and clear and indifferent, the kind of morning that doesn't soften anything. The parking lot of OPD headquarters was full by 7:45, which was unusual, and the officers moving through the building were doing so with their heads slightly lower than normal, their conversations shorter, their eyes avoiding the glass-walled conference room at the end of the main corridor where someone had already closed the blinds. Inside that room, the air smelled of burned coffee and the specific anxiety of people who have spent the weekend understanding how much trouble they are actually in. Mayor Leonard Griggs sat at one end of the long table, dabbing his forehead with a pocket square despite the fact that the room was air-conditioned to the point of being mildly uncomfortable. He was flanked by Chief of Police Raymond Colton, a compact, rigid man who had the expression of someone sitting through a dental procedure without anesthetic, and Captain Gerald Foss, who looked like he had not slept since Tuesday. Union President Greg Sutton sat at the far corner with a yellow legal pad in front of him and the posture of a man who had walked into rooms like this before and walked out intact and was currently doing the math on whether that record was going to hold. Calvin Mercer and his team entered at exactly 8 o'clock and sat down, and the silence when they arranged themselves on the opposite side of the table had a weight to it that the room's ventilation system worked steadily and unsuccessfully against. The mayor opened with the language of damage control, the kind of practiced mayoral smoothness that works at press conferences and city council meetings and almost nowhere else, offering frameworks for resolution, for quiet settlement, for a generous administrative separation that would remove Webb from the picture without leaving a mark on the institutional record. He used the phrase "going forward" 3 times in under a minute. Calvin let him finish the 3rd sentence and then said simply, and without any particular heat, that there would be no early retirement, no settlement, and no version of this that went away quietly, and he said it in the tone of a man explaining the weather. Greg Sutton leaned forward and put both palms flat on the table in the way that had worked in 100 union negotiations, the physical language of a man reminding the room that he has leverage and is not afraid to use it. He began building his case. Reasonable officer, standard high-stress environment. A man who had given 11 years to this department, and he had gotten approximately 40 seconds into it when Calvin reached into his briefcase, withdrew a manila folder, and placed it on the table in front of Sutton before Sutton had finished his sentence. Inside the folder were GPS records, timestamps, coordinates, duration for OPD, Unit 31, placing it at the end of Denise Holbrook's driveway from 2:14 to 3:41 Sunday morning. Sutton looked at the records and called it a coincidence, a patrol officers covering their routes, nothing unusual. Calvin placed a second document beside the first phone records, a call placed from Sutton's personal cell to OPD dispatch at 11:52 Saturday night, and said nothing else because there was nothing else to say. The document said everything, and both of them knew it. The mayor looked at Sutton with an expression that a man reserves for the person who has just made his situation dramatically worse. The hum of the building's ventilation system was very loud in the silence that followed. The fluorescent light in the room did something particular to everyone's complexion, and none of it was flattering. Calvin stood. He buttoned the single button of his jacket. He informed Chief Colton that effective immediately the department was operating under full federal oversight, that the terms of the consent decree were no longer being negotiated but implemented, and that Greg Sutton should contact his personal attorney because his indictment paperwork had already been drafted and would be unsealed at the appropriate time. Then he told the chief to bring in Marcus Webb. They gave Webb 2 minutes, and he used them to compose himself in the hallway in the way that men like Webb compose themselves, straightening the collar of a civilian jacket he had put on because he no longer had a uniform to wear, running a hand over his buzz cut, making the conscious decision to walk into that room the way he had walked into every room for 11 years, with the forward lean and the wide shoulders and the air of a man who occupies space as a matter of principle. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing he looked for was Greg Sutton, because Greg Sutton was the architecture of protection that had held around Marcus Webb for 11 years, the procedural force field that had made the complaints go away and the paperwork disappear, and the accountability find somewhere else to land. He found Sutton's face and read it in about half a second. And what he read there, the avoidance, the legal pad flipped face down, the way Sutton was studying the middle distance with the focused intensity of a man who has decided he is not in this room, hit Webb like a door to the face. His stride faltered, only slightly, only for a step, but everyone in the room saw it. He looked at Chief Colton. Colton looked at the table. He looked at Captain Foss, who looked at the window. He looked at the mayor, who was examining his own hands with apparent fascination. Calvin Mercer stood up from his chair, and the room rearranged itself around that movement the way rooms do when the person who actually holds the authority in them makes a physical gesture. He did not raise his voice. He did not build to the moment. He said with the directness of a man who has had this conversation before and knows that brevity is a kindness, that Marcus Webb was hereby terminated from the Oak Ridge Police Department, effective immediately, without pension, without benefits, and without the severance package that the mayor had tried to offer 20 minutes ago. Webb's face did something complicated. The arrogance and the shock arrived at the same time and crashed into each other, and what they produced was something that looked for just a moment almost like grief. The grief of a man who has confused his identity with his job for so long that losing the job feels like losing himself, which in Webb's case was perhaps more accurate than he would ever be able to admit. He turned to Sutton. Sutton did not look up. He said the union would fight this. He said he had rights. He said they couldn't do this. FBI Special Agent Dana Reeves stepped forward from the corner of the room where she had been standing quietly since 8 o'clock, and the sound of handcuffs being unclipped from her belt was very small and very loud at the same time. She was unhurried about it. She read the charges in the steady, practiced voice of someone who has done this enough times to have learned that calm is more effective than drama. Federal deprivation of civil rights under color of law, witness intimidation, filing a false police report. She told him to turn around and put his hands behind his back. Webb's knees buckled. Not completely, not the way they had buckled on him in his imagination when he had let himself think about this moment over the last 72 hours, but enough that the man standing next to him put a hand briefly on his arm. He was crying before the handcuffs were fully closed. Not silently, actually crying the way men cry when they have held it together past the point where holding together was possible. Calvin looked at Marcus Webb in handcuffs, and his expression was not triumphant, and it was not cold. It was something heavier and more honest than either of those things, the expression of a man who has seen this particular ending many times and has never found a way to make peace with the fact that it always could have been avoided. He said quietly, "You had a choice every single time. That's what makes it a tragedy and not an accident." Webb was walked out of the conference room, and the door closed behind him with a soft, ordinary click that sounded nothing like a cell door and somehow conveyed exactly the same thing. The media had been outside OPD headquarters since 6:30 in the morning. Satellite trucks double-parked along the block, reporters doing their hair in side mirrors, producers on phones, walking tight circles on the sidewalk. The story had been too large and too visible and too perfectly documented to stay local. And it hadn't by Sunday morning. It had press credentials from 3 national networks standing in front of a building that had spent the last 18 months trying to be invisible. When the federal vehicle pulled around from the secured rear exit with Marcus Webb in the back seat, the cameras caught it from 3 angles. He was not in uniform. He was in the civilian jacket he had put on that morning, thinking it conveyed a version of dignity. And he had his head down, and the meme that had spent the weekend spreading across every platform, the frozen face, the open credential case, the moment everything changed, now had its coda. The same man, smaller, quieter, being driven away from the building he had walked into every day for 11 years. The contrast wrote itself, and the internet wrote it again, and the news networks wrote it on top of that. And by Monday afternoon, the Linden Heights story had become the kind of story that people called their parents about, that grandparents asked their grandchildren to explain because they kept seeing it on the news, that people who had given up on expecting anything to be different let themselves feel something cautious and small and real about. 50 miles away, Denise Holbrook watched the coverage from her couch with her neighbor Linda sitting beside her, both of them holding cups of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The reporter on the screen mentioned that a local resident's video and subsequent witness intimidation report had been central to the federal case, did not say her name, which was fine. She had not asked for her name to be said, and Denise exhaled slowly, the way you exhale after holding your breath for long enough that you had forgotten you were doing it. Linda said, "You did that." Denise looked at the screen for a moment and then looked at her own phone sitting on the cushion beside her. The same phone, the same camera, the same 9 minutes and 42 seconds that she had almost not recorded because she had told herself as she reached for it that it probably wouldn't matter, that these things usually didn't change anything, that nobody ever actually watched these videos and felt the weight of them land anywhere real. She picked the phone up and turned it over in her hands and said nothing. The city outside was doing what cities do on Monday afternoons, moving noise, the ordinary continuous motion of people with places to be. But something in Linden Heights had shifted the way a room shifts when someone opens a window and the air that comes in is different from the air that was already there. 6 weeks after the conference room, Marcus Webb sat across a metal table in a federal holding facility 40 minutes outside the city, wearing a jumpsuit the color of a construction cone, and the thing that struck you, if you had seen him on West Callaway Street on that Tuesday afternoon, was not how different he looked, though he did look different, hollowed out. The confidence metabolized into something that left a specific kind of residue. It was how the room seemed to have no particular interest in who he used to be. The facility was loud in the constant layered way of institutions that never go quiet. Voices overlapping at distances, the mechanical slide and thud of doors, the pervasive smell of industrial cleaning products applied to surfaces that resisted being clean. The fluorescent light was the same quality as the light in the conference room where he had been handcuffed, and sometimes that similarity hit him at odd moments, pulling him back to the click of the cuffs and the way Dana Reeves had read the charges in that level, unhurried voice. The inmates knew what he was. That information moved through a facility faster and more reliably than almost anything else, and the men he passed in the corridors had their own specific relationship with the kind of officer Marcus Webb had been. Some of them carried the particular marks of it, and so he walked with his eyes on the floor and kept his interactions to the functional minimum required to exist in a space with 200 other people. And this was perhaps the most profound inversion of the man who had once walked the streets of Oak Ridge like he owned the sidewalk itself. His wife's attorney had filed the paperwork the same week the indictment was unsealed. His daughter, who was 9, had asked her mother why Daddy was on television with his hands behind his back, and the answer her mother gave her was careful and honest and age-appropriate. And would Webb understood shape something in his daughter that could not be unshapen. The union-funded attorney had withdrawn the day after Sutton's indictment, citing a conflict of interest. He now had a court-appointed public defender named Brian Holt, who was overworked and exhausted and doing his conscientious best, which everyone involved understood was not going to be enough. At night, in the particular silence that a loud institution achieves between 2 and 4 in the morning, Webb lay on his bunk, and the thing he came back to, not the career, not the pension, not the marriage, not the specific procedural decisions that had led from a quiet suburban street to a federal holding facility, was the expression on Calvin Mercer's face in the conference room. Not anger, not satisfaction, not the triumphant look of a man who has won something, just the patient, settled, almost sad expression of a man who had expected exactly this, who had been expecting exactly this for the entire 23 minutes it took Marcus Webb to dismantle 11 years of his own career on a Tuesday afternoon on West Callaway Street. That expression Webb had come to understand was harder to carry than the anger would have been. 3 months after Monday, the Linden Heights Community Center hosted a gathering that the mayor's office had carefully not called a press event, because it wasn't one. It was a Tuesday evening folding chairs arranged in a rough semicircle in a room that smelled like old carpet and somebody's slow cooker going in the adjacent kitchen, maybe 30 people. The kind of gathering where someone's child runs in circles near the folding table with the coffee urn and nobody tells them to stop. Denise Holbrook was called to the front of the room, and she walked up there in the same denim jacket she had been wearing on West Callaway Street, which was not a statement. She had simply grabbed the jacket on her way out the door because it was the one by the door, and the mayor read a few sentences from a civilian commendation certificate and handed her an envelope that contained, among other things, notification of a community journalism scholarship at Linden Heights Community College, a program she had looked up once 3 years ago and then quietly decided she couldn't afford, and stopped thinking about. She stood at the front of the room for a moment with the envelope in one hand and the certificate in the other. And the room was looking at her, and she said 2 sentences into the small clip-on microphone someone had attached to the podium that she hadn't done anything anyone else in that room wouldn't have done, and that she hoped all of them would do it next time because there was going to be a next time, and the only variable was who was watching. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said without any decoration around it. Across the semicircle, 3 people were recording on their phones. Not out of distrust, out of the particular instinct that Denise had demonstrated on a Tuesday afternoon, the understanding that documentation is a form of care, that bearing witness is a form of protection, that the phone in your pocket is either something you reach for or something you don't, and that the reaching matters. Officer Dale Pruitt-Webb's former rookie partner, who had become the department's first voluntary cooperating witness, and had been quietly reassigned to the Community Outreach Unit pending a full restructuring, sat in the back row with his cap in his hands, not recording, just watching. He had requested the reassignment himself. He was learning slowly and with the specific difficulty of a person unlearning something they were trained into, who he actually wanted to become. The OPD consent decree reforms had accelerated significantly. The restructuring that had been stalled for 22 months was moving now. 4 months later, the desk lamp in a hotel room in a different city was making the same faint buzzing sound as the one in the Marriott, and Calvin Mercer was sitting at the small desk near the window with his reading glasses on and a docket thick enough to use as a doorstop open in front of him and a cup of black coffee going cold at his elbow. And outside the window, a city that did not know he was there yet was doing what cities do on a Wednesday night in the fall. The next consent decree, the next precinct, the next set of case files detailing the same deep-rooted patterns, wearing different names and different badge numbers in a different zip code, the same architecture of unchecked authority and institutional silence, and the quiet, grinding harm it produced in the people it was supposed to protect. His phone buzzed on the desk beside the legal pad. A text from Agent Dana Reeves' Sutton indictment unsealed. 14 counts. He's taking a plea. Calvin read it. He set the phone face down. He went back to the case file and made a note in the margin about a jurisdictional question he wanted to raise in the preliminary meeting. There was a folded piece of paper on the corner of his desk. Not a legal document, not a case brief, a letter handwritten on regular paper. 3 paragraphs from Denise Holbrook. He had received it 6 weeks ago and had read it enough times that the fold lines were soft, and the paper had developed the particular texture of something handled frequently. He hadn't written back yet, which was a failure of his that he had not resolved because the right response to that letter had not yet arrived in the language he normally used, and he did not want to send her the wrong one. He stood up eventually, the way you stand up when you have been sitting for long enough that standing is its own decision, and he walked to the window and looked out at the city, the amber grid of streetlights, the slow river of headlights on the expressway, the ordinary night motion of a place full of people going home or going to work or going somewhere in between. 2 blocks down, a pair of taillights was moving steadily through the amber light, signaling a turn, observing the speed limit, doing nothing wrong. Calvin watched the car until it turned the corner and was gone. Then he went back to the desk and put his reading glasses on and got back to work. If this story called to something in you, if you have waited a long time to see accountability arrive somewhere, it was long overdue. You already know what to do. Like it, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel. We'll be here, and so will the next story.